And now I hope your dopamine level are still up and running, because we are switching age group. We have heard a lot about adult population, a little bit about, we had question on the older group, but it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Argyris Stringaris, who is the chair of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at UCL, has been awarded several prizes, but is not only a clinician, he's also a neuroscientist and a computational psychiatrist. But he's promised me that at this time of the day, it's not going to be heavy on statistics, but he's bringing us into the world of younger people. Welcome. Oh, you got your microphone.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I presume I'm the first Greek since Alcibiades to, you know who I'm talking about?
Actually,
to enter Sicily.
Yeah,
no, I'm not.
You were never too strong in Palermo, I have to say.
No, we were never too strong in Palermo. We were warded off very strongly. That
exactly.
is true. That is true. Yeah, but it's still a Greek name, which is always very nice to hear. But then, of course, perhaps the affinities with England are greater. I was thinking this morning and telling some other people, because of course, what Sicily and Britain have in common is that both were invaded by the Normans, right? So there's shared risks there, and I'll come back to that in a minute because it has some relationship to the talk I'm going to do.
Argyris, this is a proof, because you know, for people that know the flag of the Isle of Wight, it's very similar to this, and this is the Trinacria, which is the flag, in fact, of Sicily, which is the woman with the 3 legs, which is a Norman flag. Sorry, I won't interfere.
No problem at all. So, so we're going to move away from that era, 1066, around that time and all that. But and I'll try to talk to you about depression and its treatment today. I shan't talk too much about. Actually, I won't talk at all about. I'm just funded by the Wellcome Trust at the moment. I'm not going to talk much about mechanisms today, which is most of the work we do, and most of the funding we have is for that at the moment. But I will be trying to take a deep dive into the available data about the treatment of child and adolescent depression, and try to figure out with you what is going on. What is the dream of any psychiatrist, I guess, of my generation? It must be to have the same rates of success as oncologists do. There's no doubt. I mean, oncology has transformed everything, right? In some areas. So I have written a paper, actually, with my wife, who's a hematologist, called "Should Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Be More Like Pediatric Oncology?" And it's kind of a review of what's been going on. It's amazing. But it all started, of course, as you know, with chronic myeloid leukemia. They discovered a genetic defect back in the 50s, 60s, right, under the microscope. It was a translocation, Philadelphia chromosome. The translocation gave rise to a protein. It was an anti-apoptotic protein, so a protein that prevented cell death, right? Which means that there was, it allowed clonal expansion. It prevented the stopping of clonal expansion, and they created a drug called imatinib. It's amazing. It's amazing. It was licensed, I think, just the year I was finishing medical school. It was just transformative. It changed lives. And ever since, of course, other big developments have happened, right? So the most recent one is CAR T cells in children, in acute lymphoblastic leukemia in children. Up until 15, 20 years ago, if a child had ALL, you could mainly pray and do some horrid chemotherapies. No longer. So we do want to get there. That's amazing, right? The development, it's genetically very simple, and it took decades to achieve, right? Must remember that. Now, what happens with depression, though? Well, our phenotypes are messier, and I'll talk a lot about that, right? So what exactly is depression? Is it like leukemia or the leukemias? I don't think so. The key tissues are unavailable, which is an important argument, what we called in our article the tissue issue. So we don't have access to the brain as we have to blood or the bone marrow. But that's not a great argument because I don't know if people who... I used to do neurology before I did psychiatry. And one of the great pleasures of neurology, of course, is to recognize eponymous syndromes, remember them, and just point them out, you know. And that was kind of great bravado, and, you know, you could show off by doing this, except you didn't have any treatments. So all you could do is prescribe antiepileptics and steroids. This has changed, of course, and people will have heard of nusinersen, an antisense RNA probe that people use for one type of spinal muscular atrophy, right? So the tissue issue is not that strong a reason. Obviously, our disorders are multi-genetic, right? They're different. It's not just a chromosomal translocation, as far as we can tell. Common disorders are a little bit like diabetes and hypertension. You know, the kind of liability threshold type models, small effects that are small effects from multiple genes. And environments play a role in a way that you don't see in leukemias, right? What sorts of environments are we talking about? Loads. You just heard about horrid childhoods, right? A horrid childhood is unlikely to, unless you were growing up in Chernobyl or near the area where the nuclear accident happened in Japan. It won't really affect you. And there's the issue of normativity, and we talk a lot about that. I've written recently more about this. It's a very important issue. It's what are the boundaries to normality? What are we prepared to call depression? This is a very important question. And of course it varies. It varies by historical epoch, how we define it. It varies by the context in the family and the context of the person. This is not unique to psychiatry and certainly not unique to depression within psychiatry. It's true also of other areas of medicine, but it's very prominent in our case. As we say in that review that we've written, that editorial opinion piece we've written, it will be very hard to find a person who has cancer who will tell you, I don't want you to cure my cancer. But all of you who work clinically will have come across patients who will not want treatment or who will be skeptical about treatment because they consider some of the manifestations of what we call an illness a part of themselves, right? So there are those kind of very fundamental issues. Plus, this is connected to other things that, and this has to do with what I'm going to talk about in a minute, the increase in the incidence or prevalence of disorders, of psychiatric disorders, particularly amongst young people. The concepts we use in psychiatry, much more so than in oncology, we are interactive kinds, we human beings. So if I tell someone that they have depression, or that there is the possibility out there that they could have depression, that has an effect, most likely, on the people who could have depression. This is not some sort of weird metaphysics, right? I mean, you can do behavioral experiments of this sort about how much you can influence the general population by the availability of concepts. Ian Hacking, who recently died, had a lot to say about that, and it's very much worth revisiting some of his work about that, specifically about mental illness. Okay, but this is an overview of my talk. All this was kind of preliminary stuff. So the first question is, should we treat depression? The GMC, at some point at least, when I was training, had a very nice kind of benchmark, and it said, if you're a doctor, you should always be thinking about whether you would want that treatment either for yourself or, more importantly, perhaps, for a member of your family, right? So should we treat depression, and to make it more concrete, in our children, our own, our nephews, whatever there might be, the children we see in the playground? It's a very important question because, of course, it is early in age. You expose them to something early on, and, you know, we should have firm answers for this. And, of course, most people, including myself, will say, yeah, of course we should treat depression. So let's see why. Young people with depression have a higher risk of suicidality and suicide. I'll come back to that. They're far more likely to have depression in the future. They're likely to die younger and are more likely to, this is from kind of the, this odds ratio here comes from one of the British cohorts, the 1946, I think it is. We'll discuss it in a minute. And they're more likely to have a physical illness. They have a lot of disability. This is kind of this is unipolar depression here at the top, right? This is the disability adjusted years lost. These are all sorts of other illnesses and disorders. Unipolar depressive disorders in adolescence is top, right, according to the World Health Organization. And is kind of, sorry, this should be different here, the title. This is basically showing that between, in the last decade or so, the prevalence of emotional or internalizing problems and or depression has been increasing in various countries in the West. Right? This is pre-corona. Right? These are studies that are difficult to do, but it's an important kind of thing about, in relation to what we were talking about before, in thinking about, are these true increases in prevalence? Would we see them in a physical illness? What do they mean exactly? Where do they come from? Adolescent depression does increase the risk for adult depression, but it's not as massive as you would think. So you can see here that the odds ratio is 2 point something. It's obviously high, right? But you know, it's not an inevitability, obviously, and depression is also associated with premature death by close to 70 years. About 19-20% of the severe group with depression had died, compared with about 11% in the mild or no problem age group, and this is where the adjusted odds ratio of about 1.6 comes from. So this all kind of looks, gosh, yeah, I mean, it's bad, right? We should treat it, right, so far? No? Concurrent depression associated with greatly increased risk of self-harm, but the associations with adult suicidality are less clear, with studies showing mixed results. There's heterogeneity in depression, though. If you just sit down and just do combinatorics, if you had this kind of inclination when you were in your secondary school, kind of to do, you know, to try to go to Maths Olympiad or something like that, and playing with those sorts of things, you will remember that you can get very quickly to very high numbers. So those 9 symptoms, especially the way they're phrased in the DSM, can give rise to about 10,000 potential types of depression, right? Literally. And this is just the theoretical possibilities. I think Ike Fried did something very nice where he looked at I think it was a STAR-D data, where he actually looked at how many subtypes there were there empirically rather than just theoretically. And there were about 500, 600 or something like that. Now, I'm not saying this is a specific problem to depression. If you try to classify SLE, lupus, right, with the criteria of the American Rheumatological Association, you might end up with similarly big numbers, but it's important to bear in mind. But what is more important is to bear in mind, and I think in his great talk this morning, Professor Alan Young mentioned this, is the fact that there is a lot of spontaneous remission. Again, this is very different to acute myeloid leukemia, chronic myeloid leukemia and all that. There just isn't spontaneous remission, right? Which is, of course, fantastic for the people who are doing trials, because you can try pretty much anything because the outcome is death otherwise, right? So that's the counterfactual, which is not the case with us, okay? So what you have here is that 53% of adults with untreated depression show improvement in 12 months. And the rate is even higher in children. Well, you would say, well, Argyris, okay, but it's a relapsing, remitting disorder, potentially. So maybe, you know, 12 months is not good. But as you saw this morning in what you got from, you saw that, I think Alan showed this, it's the proportion, this is a survival analysis, right? And it's time on the x-axis, the proportion with no recurrent episode. And you can see that, and on average, it's about 50% who had a first episode won't go on to have another episode for many, many, many years, right? So if you had a child, think about it in this way, kind of a Bayesian way. Given a child with a first episode, how likely is it that they won't have depression ever again? Right? you can infer it from this. Given that a child is in their first episode, how likely is it that treatment will be beneficial? And we'll come to that. There's another fundamental problem, though, which is, and I know this is very unorthodox of me to go to this, but I want you to think about it, which is, if you think about, so we love disorders, right? As we've that's how we grew up medically, and it's great. But immediately when we think about disorder, we have settled the etiological question, i.e., well, it's bad for you, innit? Gotta be. But is it? Like, how do you know that it is bad? Obviously, it's very annoying to have it. It's very bad to have it. But can you distinguish between two models? The model whereby there is a liability which leads to depression, and depression leads to a negative outcome. The liability can be genetic or environmental, it doesn't matter. Versus a model where the liability is common to depression and the negative outcome. The negative outcome could be suicidality, for example. Can you see the distinction? This is very hard to resolve. And you heard from Professor Howes just now that naturalistic studies are an attempt to do this, but with the obvious problems that we have. And actually, this slide is a very strong argument why we need treatment studies, or natural experiments for that matter. So a treatment study would be an answer to this. If you could treat depression and show that you wouldn't have wouldn't have the negative outcomes, that would be pretty good, wouldn't it? I mean, it wouldn't be exactly proof of causality, but it would get you pretty close to it, right? It would be reassuring. Well, let me tell you, I don't want to speak for adult depression, but I'm sure that it's pretty similar, that we don't have data that this is the case. We don't even have data, strong data, that we can influence quality of life, or that we make a big impact on suicidality. Should we therefore believe that? No, we shouldn't, but we should do the trials, right? We should do the work, and this is exactly why treatment work is so important. Even if this is in the short run, right? Obviously, it's very hard to do RCTs for 15 years. Well, okay, but do it for 3 months, do it for 6 months. Just measure quality of life, or what matters to patients. Measure suicidality and see how it goes. I'll come to that more. So this is a very fundamental question. One way of thinking about these things is to look at Mendelian randomization, but it doesn't bypass the problem. Now, Mendelian randomization makes use of the fact that it's all a natural experiment who we are in some way, genetically speaking at least, right? Which alleles we're going to end up with, right? And what they show is that at least for some outcomes, like suicidality, a higher polygenic risk score for depression is associated with a higher risk of suicidality. Okay? Which is, you can see it here. And you can see that the predicted risk of self-harm, right, in percentage, expressed in percentage, increases ever so slightly. This is MDD, the mean it's polygenic risk score on the x-axis. And you can see that there is a slight increase across the MDD polygenic risk score quantiles in terms of predicted risk of self-harm. But again, this does not resolve the question between the two models. Model number one, the top, right, which is essentially a mediation model, and model number two, which is a shared risk factors type model. So with that in mind, we need to do more work, right? This would be what we would be saying. So what does the National Institute for Clinical Excellence recommend? What do they tell us to do? You may know this already, that they say watchful waiting, or if it's mild depression, right, do one of these things, okay, and then maybe offer individuals CBT or attachment-based family therapy. Now, I think family therapy is great, but there's very little evidence in depression. There's only, at least the last time I looked, there was one trial. It does depend a little bit on how you define family therapy as well. But Oops, there isn't terribly much, yet they say that. So it's kind of psychological treatment first. Bear that in mind, I'll come back to that. Then the moderate to severe depression is family-based family-based interpersonal therapy, family therapy or CBT for the 5 to 11-year-olds, maybe fluoxetine for 12 to 18-year-olds. Again, lots of CBT first, plus minus fluoxetine, and maybe IPT or again family therapy. You can find all this online. There's nothing kind of that's what NICE say. And you know how NICE are done. They do sit. It's great that we have NICE in Britain. It's really fantastic. I worked and practiced in America. I don't think that it is great that they don't have it. I don't think it's great how medicine is done overall in many places, though they have pockets of excellence, obviously. So it's great, but of course, it's far from infallible. In fact, it's a very human activity with all the sociological baggage that comes with it, right? So we have a love in Britain for psychological therapies. Great love. And we even want to scale it for people, right? So that everyone can have access to it, should they want to. Which is it sounds like a very noble thing to do, right? So, and certainly in depression, that's the idea in child and adolescent depression. Do CBT first, essentially, or do IPT or whatever. Okay, well that's great. Is there a trial that shows that you should do CBT? No, there isn't. It's based on the presumption that it is at least as efficacious and that it has fewer side effects. Okay? So, why then not just do psychological therapies? Why don't we just stop here? Right? Why don't you say, guys, just do psychological therapies. Go all and train if you haven't trained yet in CBT or IPT or both. Just do psychological therapies. Well, let's take a dive into psychological therapies. So this is a meta-analysis that was published by someone who I have a lot of respect for, Pim Kuipers. And it's on psychological therapies. And you might not be able to see it here, but, the pooled risk ratio, the effect size, is very much in favor of psychological therapies. Between the various meta-analyses, the extent, the magnitude of this effect size varies. Okay, it doesn't matter that much. Let's just take it at face value. So, has anyone here conducted a psychological therapy trial? Has anyone done a pharmacological therapy trial? You've done one, yes. Okay, so pharmacological therapy trials typically have a placebo arm, right? They have a placebo arm. Placebo. What is the equivalent of placebo in a psychological therapy trial? Waitlist control or treatment as usual. Well, I wasn't the PI of psychological treatment studies, but I have helped out, and I think they're very difficult to do. They cost a lot, right? Absolutely no doubt. But sorry, if I randomize you to, well, you can just carry on in our fantastic child and adolescent mental health service, right? We'll see you every 3 months. That's our treatment as usual. Or if you tell someone, you're just going to wait. You all right with that? Okay. Now, you're coming for the treatment. And by the way, it's a brand new one. It's a new kind of way of doing, of treating depression. Like, is this a fair comparison? I don't know. Does anyone think this is a fair comparison? No, right? When we talk about fairness, we talk about the thing you do when you flip a coin, right? You obviously, the stuff that gets in the way, it's deterministic randomness in a way, right? But you flip a coin, you can't control it, right? So it's biased. And I think that the results are inflated, in fact. There are, some people will say, hang on a minute, but there are trials where there have been control arms. Okay, well, let's look at a couple of them. This was one from 2020. The experimental group had an 8 weekly 1-hour session versus, as far as I could tell at least, and I'd be very happy to be corrected, a psychoeducation leaflet and the possibility of being called by the person you've been allocated to. This is another one. This is what you get: 8 ICBT modules, 8 individual therapist sessions delivered via chat, modules, text materials, cognitive restructuring, the whole lot. And I'm reading out what the controls got. Controls were assigned to a therapist and received an introductory personal platform in mail from their therapist, informing them that there would be weekly assessments and that their assessments were to be viewed by their therapist to monitor their mental health state. They were informed that their therapist might contact them to follow up on their well-being. Like, sorry, but is this like flipping a coin? It isn't, right? It isn't fair in that sense. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying that I necessarily can tell you how to do it better and what comparator you should seek, but I would have thought that at least having people doing 8 sessions with someone face-to-face would be a good comparator. But, okay, well, you don't want to do the therapy because the therapy is your active ingredient. Well, why don't you take some bloke or, woman or whatever and put them there and just have them talk for the same amount of time? That would be fair-ish. No. Okay, well, you can't do that, and it costs a lot of money, perhaps. Why don't you just do a placebo? Oh, it's been done. What did it show? Okay, this is the famous TADS study. Have people heard of the TADS study? Well, the TADS study shows that there was no separation between CBT and placebo, and adding CBT to fluoxetine did not do anything. Okay, so the only trial where the same rigor was applied to CBT as it does for pharmacological treatments did not lead to separation. And it was not badly powered. I mean, I think it's the biggest. I can't remember for sure, but it's pretty big, this study, right? And you can see the graphs here. This is placebo, the open circles, the white circles. This is fluoxetine alone, the black circles. The triangles are CBT alone. This is fluoxetine with CBT, right? And you can just see that no matter what depression outcome you look at, this is the equivalent to the Madras here, to the HAM-D, what you can see here is that there's no separation, right, between CBT alone and placebo when you use placebo. So, I'm prepared to believe, and I want to believe because I like CBT, and I'm actually right now studying the active ingredients of cognitive therapy, and I grew up in this tradition. I'm very interested in this, and I think it's very important, and I do think it has potential. But somehow for depression, we haven't got the evidence yet, I think, where we want it to be. Yes?
What about the difference between the ability, what about the differences between the cognitive ability of a child who probably wouldn't get CBT and all of this? Because that's what I find. I mean, I'm a psychologist and I work with children with depression, and I find that sometimes it's very hard to actually look at studies and really, find the true findings of them in terms of, because there's so many different levels. And
yeah, well, that may very well be true, but what argues against this is what happens in other complex disorders like social phobia. Like in social phobia, the results we have so far from Eleanor Lee's trials are, that it's equivalent to what you get from, what you get in adult cognitive therapy. And in adult cognitive therapy for social anxiety, we have some very nice trials where they have an active comparator, which is exposure. That was a really, these are really kind of brave comparisons, and this is what you want in science, right? So, it could be, but I don't think that it is the case. I think that there's so much non-specificity in depression, even in adults, right? I mean, the adult depression people here can correct me, but my understanding is that the modality of the therapy, the psychotherapy, doesn't make much of a difference. Does it? Okay. So, yes, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, wasn't there a bit more separation later on? Because the follow-ups for TADS went on for quite a long time, and then later on they found that there was added benefit from the CBT.
We can come back to that. These are interesting questions. You do realize, though, that these are very far away, and people make these claims. And I think that they're very hard to substantiate. There was a similar claim that was made for psychodynamic psychotherapy in the recent ADAPT trial about latent and sleeper effects. But I think given the time that has lapsed, I would have difficulties interpreting them, to be honest. So, are SRIs efficacious then? And if so, for whom? Okay, so we're going to go to another meta-analysis of someone, again, I respect a lot, which is Andrea Cipriani. And this is the network meta-analysis. All people will know what a meta-analysis does, right? I mean, you basically take the effect sizes and you pull them, and you weight them by the inverse of the variance, right? So kind of the standard error, right? Now, this is for the fixed effects. If it's a random effect, you just make assumptions about what these studies, where they were pulled from. You don't assume in the random effects that there is one true effect size, but you expect that there will be heterogeneity, and that's what a random effect is. A network meta-analysis, don't worry too much about it, because I'm not going to go into the inferences of the network meta-analysis. It's basically an attempt to overcome the problem of not having done head-to-head comparisons and create them post hoc a posteriori. Does that make sense, roughly? You all know that, sorry. Okay, so what you see here is that fluoxetine and placebo have the biggest circles. So most studies have included, as you might expect, placebo. And most studies, or many, the majority, or many studies, I should say, have included fluoxetine, which is no surprise, right? You probably know that. And then there are several others scattered around here, right? This was published in The Lancet in 2016, I believe. I'm going to magnify this very nice table that allows you to compare each with each. That's the point of the network meta-analysis. But for the moment, we're just going to compare placebo, this row, with all the other drugs that have been used here, like sertraline, citalopram, escitalopram, paroxetine, nifazodone, imipramine, and all that, and fluoxetine. And to cut a long story short, the only drug that shows separation is fluoxetine. And it shows, this is a standardized mean difference. You remember how the standardized mean difference is derived, right? You take the difference between placebo and drug, and then you standardize it by a pooled standard deviation, right? It's usually some sort of sum of the squared standard errors, standard deviations, and yeah, I think I have it here actually. Yeah, you can see it here. So it doesn't matter. You can see the formalisms here, but does anyone remember kind of Cohen's D rules of thumb? If you saw a 0.5, you'd say, well, it's not too bad. 0.5 is good. Okay, but you need to look at what? The confidence intervals, right? What is a confidence interval? This is very important whenever you interpret a paper. And people can get it wrong. I'm worried that I might get it wrong now. So frequentist confidence intervals. So if someone doesn't tell you that these are Bayesian confidence intervals, in which case you can interpret them as degrees of belief. We can talk about that as well. But if you take them as frequentist, standard confidence intervals, you could think about it this way. It's like I'm going to repeat the same experiment and sample again and again and again, And in the long run, a very important concept in statistics and a very nebulous one, in the long run, right, 95% of the true value will be in the 95% confidence intervals 95% of the time. Okay, that's what it means. So the width of the confidence intervals tells you something about the precision of your estimate. So can you see what the precision of the estimate is here? So it ranges from 0, 0.03, to 1. 1 is a whopping effect size. If you have an effect size of 1, you can just, book your tickets for Stockholm, if you can replicate it. So far, insulin and methylphenidate only have reached those effect sizes. And methylphenidate is probably a bit lower, the true ones, about 0.8, but it's quite substantial. So this is pretty wide, right? And it doesn't fill you with confidence that the truth is actually not below 0. It doesn't cross the 0 line, does it? So we need to kind of now start decomposing this, right? This estimate is significant, of course, at the 0.05 level, and it hides a lot of possibilities. If I tell you it's 0.5, right, you take it at face value, it could mean all sorts of things. It could mean 0 minus 0.5, or it could be 0.5 minus 1, and these are important things. So always when you see kind of parameters and things that you arrive at after lots of subtractions, and particularly divisions are really naughty because they can hide a lot of information. Just go back and try to see what that means, right? How would you do that? Okay, let's just focus on these two things here, which is the response rate, right? How many people respond to a drug? And you can take these as representative for most of the stuff. About 65% respond to the medication group, let's say placebo, and 53% to the placebo. Okay. What does that mean? What are the two things that you notice here? If I told you I'm going to give you a drug that in 2/3 of the people does a good job, would you say, thank you, doctor? You probably would, right? You'd say, oh, that's amazing. 2/3, that's cool. Of course, you're trained and you're going to ask, compared to what? Like 2/3 compared to what exactly? Like if I sat and did nothing, how would it be? Like the placebo is meant to do that, right? Sort of. And it tells you, the placebo, that you would go to 53%. So how big is the difference? It's about 10 to 12% difference between the two. Is that huge? It's hard to get an intuition for these things. If these were to be scaled across the whole population, then that would be quite a thing. That 10% scales up, it becomes a lot if you do it in millions. I'm not suggesting you should, okay? Because there are side effects, all sorts of things. My God, this is my conscience speaking to me. Sorry. Was this directed at me or?
Is this a man's contribution online or?
Oh.
I think it's somebody that must have muted themselves online.
Okay. Maybe I've exasperated people so much with what I'm saying.
Actually, he sounded like a child, Argyris, so maybe it was directed to you.
Well, one should listen to children. I'm a child psychiatrist. Okay, so one intuition that people have for this is the numbers needed to treat. Do people remember how to arrive at numbers needed to treat? Who wants to say? Basically, you take the inverse of the absolute risk reduction, right, which is the difference. So if you take the inverse of this difference, 60-odd to 50-odd, you arrive at 1 by 12, 1 by 11, 1 by 10, somewhere there, right, depending on which ones you do the difference for, right? So what does the numbers needed to treat mean? It means the number of people you would have to treat so that one person responds over those whom you would have expected to respond because of placebo. Does that make sense? I hope I said it right. So, okay, so the numbers needed to treat are about 1 in 10, 1 in 12, something like that. Okay, so this is not great, but what you can see is when people tell you SRIs don't work, well, that's not strictly speaking true. It's just the placebo works pretty well as well for some reason, right? Okay, so, this is what I just told you. Fine. So, and that's across the board. This is the norm, with some exceptions, which I'll come to in a minute. Okay, so the response to antidepressants isn't bad, but so is the response to placebo. What explains responses to placebo? So one meta-analysis that was done back in 2007 said, look, guys, it's like with the adults. And if you had read Irvin Kersh's analyses, Irvin Kersh had already said years ago, it's your baseline severity, right? If you're severe enough, you're going to respond. If you're not severe, you're less likely to respond, right? For those who remember, there was a big controversy. There was reanalysis of the data, what have you. I'm going to come back to something from Irvin Kersh from more recently, which is very pertinent to what we're discussing. But people found that in children and adolescents as well. Okay, that was one thing. The CGI severity score at baseline, you can see the placebo response is higher the lower the severity is. The other thing is the number of study sites, which also correlates with something else which is very interesting that I'm going to come to. The more study sites you have, the more problems you have, in the sense that you have a bigger placebo response. Why would that be? Sorry? No. Variety of, prescribers in this case, I guess, possibly. But why would you have a bigger placebo response? This kind of may give us some clues about the nature. They're not giving different placebos here and there. Maybe in some ways, what is it exactly? These findings, some of these findings were replicated, I think this was last year, I should say 2022 here, by the group of Johannes Hebebrand, that showed that, again, odds of response to placebo arm is higher the more number of study sites you have. Study duration didn't play a role. So it seems to be a replicated finding, right? Has anyone done a pharmacological trial in children and adolescents that was drug company sponsored? They tend to have lots of sites, typically. We'll come back to that. Okay. So, placebo response. I just wanted, what did I want to show you here? I think I better come back to that later because there's a particular reason. Yeah, exactly. So the placebo response in young people is higher than it is in adults, than the equivalent one in adults, right? And you can see the figures here, 45% versus 36%, and non-overlapping confidence intervals. Why would that be? You see what I mean? That difference of about 10 to 11% could be all the rage, right? In terms of separating from placebo. Now, let's come to something else. This table here is very interesting because if I had told you, let me just go back. If I had told you which studies are more likely to show that drugs work well, pharma funded or publicly funded, which ones will show a bigger drug effect? Pharma, right? Everyone says that. Well, it's exactly the opposite in children and adolescents. In fact, the better separation from placebo comes from the two well-conducted, particularly this March one, well-conducted pharmacological study. Publicly funded pharmacological study. Rather than don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is the truth and this is false, but I'm just saying, right? And look at the sites, right? It's 1 and 13, and there you have up to 65 sites. What people have argued is that it is very hard to control the quality of the recruitment if you have 65 sites that are typically scattered around the world. But why would that matter in terms of the placebo response? How would that affect the placebo response? Well, spontaneous remission might be one explanation, right? So there could be a placebo response, and what could be hidden in what we think is placebo response could be what? Oh, it just got better. Anyway, right? Thank you very much. Within the next 8 weeks, I was going to get better anyway. Which goes back to the ethical problem of prescribing drugs. Okay? Particularly to people who are not very severe. So, it may be because of that. Okay, and I'm coming back to these people here, they used, it's the FDA and Irving Kirsch joining forces, and they took the FDA data from the last, several decades, and they pulled all the data together, all the individual study actual data, which is really great, right? And just looked at what's happening, right? People have read this, haven't they? Most of you will have seen this. It was a big news in the BMJ. It was published earlier in the summer of 22, right? So there were two findings that were quite interesting here. Most of you will have heard about the mixture model that they applied. So a non-parametric approach to the data they had, or an approach to the non-parametrically distributed data they had. I'll come to that. But there was another interesting finding, which was the following. And I'm putting the text here because the figures are more difficult to figure out. So I'm just going to start here. Comparing pediatric, which is what the Americans call it, under age 18, participants directly with adults, the unadjusted difference between drug and placebo was 1.12 points, greater for adults. But if you adjust it for baseline severity, the difference between drug and placebo was greater by only 0.64. So it was nearly halved, which means, I'm translating this, that child and adolescent studies have in general recruited less severe cases. This is predicated on the harmonization they did between the adult instrument and the child instrument, which is another big story, but let's take that, at face value. Does that make sense? Great. I'm not going to, it's too late for that in the day. But this is how the data are distributed, right? So if you look at this histogram here, right, this is how the data look for responses. What you see here is change in the HAM-D, right? The main outcome measure for depression, which has been harmonized for children and adolescents as well. But this is everyone, adults and children and adolescents and everything. And what they came up with was this mixture model. I don't know how many of you, people often do growth mixture models for longitudinal data to come up with latent classes and say, this is a highly rising one, this is a flat one, this is one that goes down. You've come across that sort of stuff, right? It's a way of assigning posterior probabilities to individuals and therefore put them into groups by virtue of those posterior probabilities. So, so they came up with an optimal solution of 3 groups: a large response group, a minimal response group, and a non-specific group. And the large response group showed a mean change from baseline of 16 points, the minimal just 2 points, and the non-specific 0.894. But what was more important is that in the large group, the active drug response was 24%, whereas the placebo was 10%, so a difference for 14%. Whereas for the other groups, these were much smaller differences, like the non-specific was 63% and 69%. Does that make sense? So there was a wow, and people said, okay, so if we then took, if we know this, then we know that there is a subgroup of people whom we can really help. This is really good stuff. Now, there have been concerns about the way this has been interpreted. And now, this looks here at the cumulative distribution of responses, right? And the y-axis shows the probability that a participant would achieve a result that is at least as good a reduction, a change in HAM-D that you see here on the x-axis. And what you can see is that drug and placebo are not different very much. Do you see what I mean? That the cumulative distributions are nearly overlapping. Maybe there is a difference here at around 11, 12 points of change in HAM-D score, but nothing like those big clusters. One thing that happens is, and I'm grateful to someone who I don't know, it's Dr. Plerdel, and I don't know the person, but I'm thanking him because he pointed that out. And he very clearly used our plots here to show us, to translate this into difference from baseline, and you can see that you achieve a difference of about 10% between drug and placebo at a difference from baseline about 10 points. But in general, on average, they don't differentiate terribly much, would be his argument. Okay. So, just in case you read this paper, bear that in mind, right? There's been an ongoing discussion, but it's important to bear in mind that when you categorize data, you may lose crucial information. Right? So it's worth going back to kind of the raw-ish data. Okay, now are SRIs ineffective across the board? Are they just, stupid? We shouldn't even start with them. And you will hear people say, don't even think about it. Just don't even think about it. Well, A more nuanced approach would be to say, well, do they do anything for anything else? And the answer is yes. Like the placebo response for anxiety disorders is much lower. So the separation between active drug and placebo is much better. Right? This is a meta-analysis of those studies, and you can see here the total for SRIs is a Hedges G. Again, think of it as a corrected version of the Cohen's D. Right? It has a little correction, as I recall, which is 0.2. And here you have SSRIs for anxiety disorders, a pooled one of 0.71. Always look at the confidence intervals. They don't even overlap, right, between the two. So you could say that they are really different between each other, if that makes sense, right? Non-overlapping confidence intervals means they're different at the 95% confidence interval level, right? So they do work for anxiety. Why don't they work for depression? Or what happens in depression and we have this situation, right? And spontaneous recovery is a favorite explanation at the moment, right? Particularly in young people, which seems to be possibly higher. Okay, what about suicidality? And this is a very important question, because if you were to put your child or your sister's or brother's child, your nephew or any child on an antidepressant, and someone told you that you increased their risk for suicidality, you wouldn't like that, would you? But the FDA told you so and put a black box warning on it. Do you remember? Okay. So you should be concerned about this, and this is something that we must, of course, tell the patient when we prescribe them antidepressants and their children and adolescents. We must tell the patient, we must tell the family. You can't just pretend this hasn't been there. Luckily, we have, again, there's been several meta-analyses, and I'll come to Andreas because I think it's really great, and I don't think that people have disputed it very much. I think both kind of camps, if you think about it in terms of people for and against drugs, and children and adolescents were kind of, I don't think they were equally happy or equally unhappy about it. And, you know, generally quite high quality. So I just want to say here that in the trials, and I'll qualify this in a minute, but in the trials that have been conducted with fluoxetine, which have included about 800 people, according to my counting, there have been 0 suicides. Okay, as we were saying this morning, one very handy way that if you don't know it, you can just have it in your pocket for interpreting 0 numerators for any sample size above 30 is that you can always say that it is the upper confidence interval of the risk is 1 by n, right? So if you do 1 by n for this, you will find, 3 by n, what am I talking about? Sorry, it's too late in the day. No coffee, it's 3 by n, right? And anyone who wants to see the derivation of that, I can send them, we did it recently with our lab. It's very nice. So 3 by 800, and that gets you to about, it should say here 0.4%, I'm sorry, rather than 4%. So if you have a 0 numerator in those 800, you have an upper bound of the 95% confidence interval, right, of 0.4%, which is very low. And indeed, there haven't been completed suicides in those 800 people. Okay. So you shouldn't say the risk for suicide, according to these data, but I'll come to qualify them in a minute. However, there has been an increase here we are. There has been an increase in suicidality potentially with some drugs, like venlafaxine wasn't great, but for fluoxetine, which is what NICE tells you to use, right? If you compare fluoxetine to placebo, you'll see that it's 0.9 with confidence interval stretching from 0.049 to 1.49, right? And these are odds ratios, right? Here the question is whether it crosses, not the 0, right? But, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so, can you see that? Right, so fluoxetine doesn't seem to, according to these data, be particularly problematic if you accept this as the level of inference, right, the 95% confidence intervals. Now, however, being me, I went back and I looked at the individual studies, right, and I said, how many of these studies had children who were really suicidal. How many do you think? I don't think many. We exclude them. Anything with significant suicidality is excluded. Right? So I went back to the studies that have used fluoxetine. Some of them I couldn't find, this is the NAs, I couldn't find the mention. And in some of them, and in the rest of them, the ones here, they have been excluded. So whom do they exclude? People who have significant suicidality, have been recently hospitalized. Who do you prescribe for, though? Do you prescribe for the people who come walk into your clinic and say, I would really like to have an antidepressant? If you have been suicidal, nah. You probably just wouldn't, right? You might even say, let's just wait, maybe have some psychotherapy, maybe just come back next week, right? So this is a trial that begs to be done. So I'm going to go to NIHR and tell them, I'm going to take a little pause from doing mechanisms. I'm going to do this trial. Would you please fund it? I'm sure they won't, but anyway. So because we need that, right? You need to do a trial in those whom you're supposed to be doing, and do it with great care, of course, because you might be increasing the risk for suicidality if you're doing it in those patients. Or you might be benefiting them, you never know. But it's a very important question. Okay, now what do you do if SRIs don't work? Have I come to the end? I have lost sense of time. 5 minutes. So the answer is there isn't much evidence except for one very brave and good trial, which was the Tordia trial. So I'm going to summarize everything now, and anyone who wants more, I can send them my talk. And the Tordia trial said if you have given one SRI, well, just give another if people haven't responded. And indeed, it seems to be good for you to increase, the probability that you might respond the second SRI. Okay. Bottom line is don't give venlafaxine to children and adolescents, probably, unless you're really desperate. You've tried everything else. There's been a recent trial of ketamine, very small effect size, a very small sample size, 17 people, crossover design, effect size of 0.7, wide-ish confidence intervals. The control was midazolam. I'm pretty sure they were all unblinded, like we're talking about this morning. But it was tolerated okay. But 17 people, if it's a zero, what did we say? If it's a zero numerator, 3 by 17 doesn't sound very good, right? The upper bound of the confidence interval. So, ketamine is a possibility, though, if you're really desperate. What about TMS? Because people usually ask me about TMS. Well, if you read this is where RCTs are so interesting. If you read all the open label trials, right? It's amazing. It's like, best things in sliced bread, like effect size up to 2, extraordinary stuff. Now, if the one RCT that has been done in children and adolescents showed essentially an effect size of 0. So pretty much nothing. Now, there could be several reasons for that, and more needs to be done with TMS and all that, but just so that you know. Okay. There are obviously other possibilities, like you could, and we have written a whole paper about this, what to do with treatment-resistant depression. By the way, often treatment-resistant depression isn't treatment-resistant depression, it's the depression that hasn't been actually treated. So people say, you ask your patient, have you had fluoxetine? Yes. How much? 10 milligrams. For how long? 1 week. What happened then? Oh, I felt a bit energized and was discontinued. Okay, this is quite common. So obviously that is not an adequate therapeutic trial. Or you think, have you had therapy? Yeah, I did. What exactly were you doing in therapy? And it ends up, well, it's not exactly what NICE recommends. So you need to bear that in mind when someone tells you they've had 2 antidepressants and 1 psychological therapy, which is what often the current definition is in child. And, that's how we defined it, at least. That was the working definition. So bear that in mind. You can obviously do what the adults do, and we extrapolate the evidence backwards. So we use quetiapine, in desperate cases, particularly where there is bipolar depression, right? So we have used in very desperate cases, and other antipsychotics, like we might use aripiprazole. So you just, do whatever you can after a certain point. But these are rare, and they should be rare. And most people who work with children and adolescents in non-hugely specialist settings probably will come across this quite rarely. Right? If I have to tell you one thing that I would like you to take as a take-home message is, treat the comorbidities first, particularly the anxiety. It is very rare in the clinic to see a child who doesn't have anxiety disorders. Typically GAD and social anxiety disorder. These are crippling problems, and they're treatable, right? And these are very, particularly social anxiety disorder is a very circumspect problem that you can kind of, as opposed to kind of depression, which can be very diffuse. And you can target the avoidance. And in fact, you can do some behavioral activation on the side, because modern behavioral activation, as some of you will know, targets the avoidance. So it's actually quite good to do that. And you might achieve, and we're doing a meta-analysis actually on that now, trying to show that if you target social anxiety disorder, you might have quite big benefits for depression. Does that make sense? But so do that. A forgotten disorder in depression is very often body dysmorphic disorder. This is not uncommon in adolescents, concerns about how they look. It's often kind of comes together with some eating concerns, and people focus on those and not the BDD, or some social anxiety concerns and they don't focus on the BDD. Again, it's worth taking these into account. So good assessment is important. And I'm not going to show you any more slides, and I think I've come to the end of my presentation. To the end of my presentation now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Argyris. I know it's very difficult to talk at this time of the day, especially after everything people have eaten. But any questions?
I've got to ask you a question, because you asked me one.
I'll ask you a simple one, just to remind you.
So I'm going to ask you a really simple one then. So why do SSRIs work for anxiety disorders and not so well for MDD in adolescents?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. The only the difference is in the placebo response, right? So if you look at the response rates, the actual response rates are the same for the active drug, but they differ for the placebo. So it must be something in what comes under placebo response. So it may be that you don't have the rate of spontaneous remission. That'll be one explanation in my mind. But you may have a better one.
So my follow-up, if I may be permitted, is because we don't see that pattern in adults.
You don't?
I don't think so. So any thoughts why? Or is that...
Well, the rates, as we've said, the rates of placebo response in depression in children are higher than the rates of placebo response in adults, right? So maybe the anxiety, the nature of the anxiety disorder is the same, whatever. Anxiety disorders are the same and have this, or at least have the same placebo response in both, but depression doesn't. And we know that depression has a higher placebo response in children. By the way, the higher placebo response is not unique to depression in children and adolescents. You get it, for example, in treatment-refractory epilepsy, right? So you get it in other areas as well. And of course, the placebo response is not unique to psychiatry, in case someone comes and tells you that. My favorite one is, I don't know how many of you lift weights, but my favorite one is one from the 70s, the era before ethics committees, where you could tell people, I'm going to give you steroids, anabolic steroids, and you actually gave them saline. And people put on both mass and their bench press and their squat increased dramatically, just by telling them that they were going to get. So, those were the times when people were permitted to do these sorts of things. So there is placebo response across the board in hypertension. And in another talk, I've kind of gathered some of the evidence from the rest of medicine. Not as pronounced, usually. Thank you. It's a good question.
Also, this is not actually, I thought it was an online question, but it's a wonderful talk, very interesting. Can I have your slides? Okay, well, that's a different story.
Yes, it is technically speaking a question. And the answer is to the affirmative, yes.
Hello.
Hi.
I was wondering if there's any evidence in young people related to the gut-brain axis and depression.
Yeah, there is, but it's not great evidence, is my understanding. But we are doing now with the obstetricians in Liverpool. I forgot to say, this is another welcome project that I'm involved in that. I'm advising. I'm not the PI. It's the famous seagull study, where they have 10,000 Liverpoolians to they're being mothers who fall pregnant, and they're being followed up for years after that, scans and everything in utero, everything, and all the samples you can imagine, which I can't name. And so, this will be obviously an observational study. It will be very interesting to see what happens, and I'm kind of part of the team for the mental health outcomes. Now, we are hoping that Wellcome and others will kind of fund us to do the proper big longitudinal study, because, of course, the age of risk for depression, for example, is adolescence, right? That's when it shoots up. So we'll need to take a few years, but they're recruiting the mothers now. So it's quite exciting, actually. Yeah.
Thanks. I have a question. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I just wonder if you have any comments on, I guess, an evolutionary perspective for, I guess, emotions such as low mood and anxiety, and whether we are overdiagnosing, overtreating, and whether the seemingly universality of these, I guess, emotions are we overfixate and try and overtreat.
Yeah, I have a whole talk devoted to this, which I was going to give tomorrow, but then I thought that because it is aimed at clinicians, I should talk more about irritability and emotion dysregulation, because people see that in their clinic, whereas the evolutionary stuff, but I have whole talks and we're writing papers on this. It's a very important question. In fact, the whole theory of emotions, or the theories of emotions, and whether emotions are or aren't, is central to psychiatry, because most of our disorders have to do with emotions, right? And what people don't realize is people treat emotions as if they were kind of natural entities. They use a very antiquated model, pre-Platonic even, that you are kind of being stricken by emotions. It's very romantic. I fell in love. And, my life changed and all that, which does happen, as we all know. But emotions have other functions as well, right? So you throw emotions at others, and society expects you to have certain emotions. They're very interactive emotions. And the way we regulate them is not just hedonic, it's also instrumental. So there's a huge amount of it. And if that's true, for which there's experimental evidence also from our group, then it seems that it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that it could easily, a disorder that is based on some thresholds for something emotional could easily lead to, I don't want to say it's over-labeling, but to pretty big fluctuations across time in terms of what is a disorder. So if you ask me personally, but I have to adduce the evidence for that, yes, I do think that the prevalence is inflated, provided there is a true prevalence. But, there's quite a lot that is being diagnosed, and I don't think this is necessarily good. But also imagine something else from sociology. What does it mean to have a disorder these days, right? It's become very medicalized, and I'm, very medical. Not some sort of, just, come from neurology. I'm kind of very, very, very medical. But is it good to say, to someone you have a medical illness? In some cases, it's probably very good. It's liberating. In some cases, it's probably not good, right? Because people act, because we're interactive kinds, people act out the label that is given to them, probably, right? Because you become that person who has that thing. And we've written an article on this, and we're trying to test this now, the notion that one of the most difficult things, I think, is to be inconsistent with yourself. So if the image you have about yourself is of a particular kind, even if that kind is negative, I think you will find it very difficult to change. Now, one of the key things is that in child and adolescent psychiatry, our illnesses are early onset, and they're chronic. These are not the things like, oh my God, I just, had a manic episode. It's like, oh, I've been depressed, and I've had an awful life with all sorts of bad life events happening to me. I am that sort of person. Telling a person, well, you can be someone else, well, that may be a dissonance with who they want to be and who they've learned to be. I'm not saying that it is fate or anything like that, but we need to take that into account. I think this is fundamentally different to what happens when you have acute myeloid leukemia, for example. If you say, well, I didn't have it yesterday, I have it today, please take it away from me. Like when my father had acute myeloid leukemia, it wasn't even a second thought. He just rushed to the hospital and said, just treat me, right? That's not always the case with the stuff that we're dealing with, particularly with young people.
Hi, I was just wondering if you would use bupropion as a primary antidepressant in someone with comorbid ADHD?
No, I don't. Maybe we should do the trials, the proper trials. But the way I treat ADHD and comorbidity is I first treat the ADHD, just because it makes sense. Because the treatment effect you can achieve for ADHD is massive and quick. And within a week, maybe two, oh my God, this is working, right? So I would just use the regular methylphenidate. And very often, what happens is that ADHD, creates depressogenic environments, right? So no one likes you. And at some point, you do start to care about the fact. So this is from an old football motto, but you know what I mean, right? People at some point think, oh gosh, no one really likes me. Okay, so if you could revert that by treating the ADHD, I think very often you don't need to treat the depression, in my experience, but we need to do those trials. The other thing is, someone talked about modafinil this morning. There have also been trials with methylphenidate in old age depression and some with regular depression. It's quite an interesting thing to use in anhedonia, obviously, right? And again, anecdotally, I've used it based on my interest in reward processing and all the mechanistic work that I do, and because I was desperate and didn't have anything else, again, to good effect, but this is very anecdotal. So, but I would go rationally and first treat the ADHD, unless someone is catatonic, of course, which is then a different matter. ADHD is also probably slightly inflated at the moment, but that's a whole different talk. Yeah.
This was great. You might actually have the pleasure to chat to Argyris over the aperitif. So please join me in thanking him once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.